Alrighty, so this is my presentation on Voyer et al.'s paper on context, contrast, and tone of voice in auditory sarcasm perception. I hope that you like it as much as I do. I thought this was an interesting article to choose because I myself use sarcasm a lot in my conversation. So here we go. So first, a little bit of background on Daniel Voyer, the writer of this paper. He's still currently a professor at the University of New Brunswick, and his research interests include cognition, perception, perceptual asymmetries, and the gender-related differences in cognitive abilities. So this study, what does it investigate? It wants to look into how context and tone of voice interact in the perception of sarcasm. So it uses 4 experiments to investigate the interaction and the main effects between the two things. So I think a really particular relevant thing is this little clip art girl on the bottom. She's saying the words, "oh great," but from her eyes you can tell the context is negative, and she doesn't mean a good "oh great," she means an "oh great" with a sarcastic tone. So the introduction of this paper talks about a little bit of a scenario, so you guys can kind of think of this as you're watching this video. So think that you're moving all of the things home from your dorm, and you have a lot of heavy boxes to do, and your friend is just sitting there watching you, not even offering to help. You then say to your friend, "you're a big help." But of course I just said that with a sarcastic tone. But did you tell my sarcastic tone because of the context of the situation? Or was it because I used a sarcastic rather than a sincere tone when I was saying the phrase? So think about that a lot when we go into the studies here, and I'm going to start off with a little bit of a video. Let's hope it works. I learned how to do some coding in order to make this video happen for you guys. No! Well, unfortunately, our video is not working here for us today, so I can just summarize it for you, and if you're interested, you can go ahead and YouTube and look this up. But in any case, for those of you who are familiar with The Big Bang Theory, Sheldon's a character who's a little bit odd, and he's basically practicing with Penny how to use some sarcasm for his friends. So if we go on to the next slide, you'll see the phrases. So, he said to Penny when they were practicing, "oh, by the way, thank you for the delicious cocoa." But when he said it, Penny thought that he was being serious, and in fact, he meant to say that the cocoa was not in fact delicious. In the later scenario, he's going to talk to his friends, and he wants to say, "let me say again how deeply sorry I am for my earlier behavior." And the words here look pretty darn sincere, but in fact, Sheldon meant it with a sarcastic tone of voice. So, I said he seems to have a sincere voice, but does context in fact help here? So we'll find out. It's important to start with the definition of sarcasm. There's a couple different definitions, but the one that the authors chose to use is this one, and it means an utterance with literal evaluation that's implicitly contrary to its intended evaluation. So we'll look at this example here below, and it says, "what a great day." So when you're saying "what a great day," you have to investigate, is the day in fact cold or is it rainy? Or is the day rather beautiful and hot and sunny? So the second context here, the hot and sunny, would imply a literal meaning of a great day. The first one would be a figurative or a sarcastic meaning. So we just talked about this in class today, in fact, about Grice's maxims of conversation, and clarity in fact was one of them. The authors briefly discuss in this one that using sarcasm in fact comes at the cost of clarity. It increases the amount of effort that listeners must put in order to understand the statement. So you have to a little bit think about what people are saying here. So the first experiment. Participants were asked to rate the tone of voice to the statement that followed the context on a scale of 1, very sincere, to a scale of 7, very sarcastic. When the context and tone were congruent, the proportion of sarcastic responses should have been high and response times should be fast. The experimenters used a female voice, it was a computer, and they used the computer rather than a human so that they could prevent some bias. So in this experiment, there were 4 pairings, and these pairings happened to have 2 different contexts and 2 different tone of voice. So the context could be either positive or negative. So in the, good day versus bad day, was it hot and sunny or was it cold and rainy? And then in the 2 tones of voice, they either use a sincere voice or a sarcastic voice. And maybe I can demonstrate that for you without embarrassing myself. So they were presented with a positive or negative context, and then there was a break between, and then they were given the probe statement, and they were asked to rate it as sincere or sarcastic. They were then asked to indicate whether it was sincere or sarcastic. And then sarcastic comments were coded as 1, whereas sincere were coded as 0. And this comes in a little bit later when we're talking about the results of some later experiments. So for this study, 64 undergraduate students were participating, and it's important to note that none of the same students participated in each experiment, so each experiment was fresh and new. So I wanted to give you a few of the statements that they included here. Aren't you special? Isn't she friendly? Tell me about it. Thanks a lot, and that worked well. So obviously I just tried to say that in as neutral of a tone as possible, but you can think about some of these phrases and how they are applicable to your own life. Have anyone ever said to you, thanks a lot, after you spilled coffee all over them? Or, well, that worked well, after you just messed something horribly wrong? So anyways, back to the real experiment. The results were that the negative context associated with high percentage of sarcastic responses. So this was kind of what they had predicted, and then on the same leaf, the positive context produced small percentage of sarcastic responses. Additionally, the tone of voice had a significant main effect. The sarcastic tone produced sarcastic responses, while the sincere tone produced few sarcastic responses, which is to be expected. And then finally, context and tone of voice produced a significant interaction. And then I'll clarify this a little bit more for you. Basically, the proportion of the sarcastic responses were highest when there was that sarcastic initial context with the negative pairing, and the lowest for the sincere with the positive context pairing. The response time for congruent pairs was relatively faster, whereas response time for the incongruent pairs were slower. So I'll give you a little bit of an example of this so you can kind of quantify that. So we'll look at sarcastic with a negative context. So this would be when you say, we'll go back to the it was a great day example. So if I said it was a great day, that was me trying to use sarcasm. And then a negative context would be, for example, when it actually was, gloomy outside. So I hope that clarifies that for you. So we'll move on to experiment 2 now. And basically their addition here was they wanted to add in an ambiguous content relevant to each of the 12 statements that was used. So previously they either just had a positive or negative scenario, but they also kind of wanted to test what it looked like in between to see if there was some effect here. But other than that, the procedure was identical. So the results. Again, they saw a significant main effect of both context and their tone of voice. A sarcastic tone in a high literal contrast should confirm the sarcastic intent for a listener. Therefore, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing for you here, is listen to this one. An ambiguous context followed by a sincere tone should result in proportion of sarcastic responses between the positive context and 0.5, and the sarcastic tone should have a proportion between 0.5 and the negative context. So what does that mean? Well, I said earlier how they coded the things. So they coded sarcastic as 0 and non-sarcastic as 1. So basically that's just saying that you should see it between the specific context and the halfway point, if that makes sense for you. And, in fact, that was their prediction, and that's what happened. So then in experiment 3, they kind of wanted to build off of their prior studies, but they wanted to additionally add on statements that weren't stereotyped. And what this kind of means here is I showed you the set of words that they'd used earlier. And some of the words were extremely common in sarcastic scenarios, for example. Well, that worked well. I feel like that's a pretty common sarcastic statement. Most people don't say, that worked well, in a positive way. So in this one, they wanted to use situations that weren't specifically stereotyped. And I'm going to show you a couple of those coming up. So their new stimuli was in fact taken from other studies. It was from written vignettes from the Sarcasm subtest of the right hemisphere communication battery. And again, same procedures. So here's some examples, and I apologize that there's so much writing on this one page, so bear with me. You can just listen to me while I say it. The initial statement was, Olivia is a good cook. And so the positive version of this would be, Olivia and Penny shared a house with 3 other people. They all took turns cooking dinner. It was Olivia's night to cook, and she made lasagna. It came out great and was delicious. Penny said to another roommate, ... And now for the ambiguous statement. Olivia and Penny shared a house with 3 other people. They all took turns cooking dinner. It was Olivia's night to cook, and she made lasagna. It came out of the oven and turned out okay, but not great, Penny said to another roommate. And then the negative statement. Olivia and Penny shared a house with 3 other people. They all took turns cooking dinner. It was Olivia's night to cook, and she made lasagna. It came out burnt and almost impossible to eat, Penny said to another roommate. So you can kind of see some similarities between these statements. They tried to keep them same in length and same for the most part, other than the really minor tweaks to change the tone. So you see pretty much all the words they changed was the word burnt and the word impossible to eat. But other than that, they did a pretty good job keeping this consistent. So again, for this experiment, it confirmed their earlier predictions, but it basically just used the new statements in order to make sure that their first ones in experiment 1 and 2 weren't biased. So it found out that a congruent context and tone of voice equaled a faster response time when compared to those presented with the incongruent pairings. It's important to note that this time the statements weren't inherently biased, as I said. Finally, this is the last experiment, and it was intended to replicate experiment 2, but with additional ambiguous context. So there are 36 combinations from 6 statements, 3 contexts, and 2 tones of voice. So those 3 contexts here were the ambiguous, the positive, negative, the 2 tones of voice for the sarcastic or the sincere. So their findings. Again, comparatively to the other experiments, there were main effects of both context and of tone of voice. And then here's what I've listed in their response times. So it's interesting here to see that the fastest for people to respond to were the negative and sarcastic pairings. Next were the positive and sincere. So in both of these cases, those had a congruent match. Negative and sarcastic, positive and sincere. It's interesting to note here that the last values are negative and sincere and positive and sarcastic. People struggled the most with those. This was evidence that was even stronger than experiment 2, as the strong contrast pairings, those 2 at the bottom, had even slower responses than the weak or the ambiguous ones that you see in the middle. So what are some conclusions from this study? Well, both context and tone influence how sarcasm is perceived, while supporting the importance of both contrast effects. Also, this research is really unique because previous research in this field has all been visual vignettes rather than auditory stimuli, and this was all auditory. So essentially, context biases tone of voice. I thought about a couple of other experiments as I was reading through this one. Maybe you guys did too. I was thinking about how culture affects this. Particularly, do people of certain cultures have an easier time detecting sarcasm? For example, do Americans have an easier time detecting sarcasm than perhaps their Chinese counterparts? Also, do individuals entirely miss the sarcasm in an English statement if English is not their first language? I know sometimes it's hard to determine if something's not literal what someone actually means, and I can imagine this would be really difficult if you first learned a different language and then you learned English and the grammar rules. So obviously this is a video, so you can't ask me any questions right now, but if you think of anything while you're watching this, absolutely reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share this article with you, as I hope you found it as interesting as I did. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.